that would have been.
Shit.
Well, it's funny now, but it wouldn't have been funny if that had happened
so
in an
sorry,
hour.
Matt.
Alright, cool.
Right,
Cool.
Okay, I think that should be good now.
Alright, welcome everyone. We're here at Grow Heathrow. I'm Matt, and today we're talking about ancient Greece, stuff that happened over 2,000 years ago, and yet here you are in a darkened room listening to a talk about it. Why? Why does it matter? Stuff that happened so long ago. Okay, so this is Goethe. He's considered to be the German Shakespeare. He's a Renaissance man, so as well as writing plays, he was also a scientist. Most of all, he wanted to be a painter, but his talents lay in other areas. He's a man of great artistic talent. Would anyone like to be Goethe? I'll be Goethe. For all other cultures, one must make allowances. To the Greek alone, one is always a debtor. Now, he's a bit, as much as he produced great art, he's a bit posh, Goethe. So here we have somebody from the other end of the spectrum. This is Rudolf Rocker, one of the old school anarchists, wrote the book on anarcho-syndicalism. If we don't have a Goethe in the room, have we got a Rocker?
A culture which could influence the totality of European peoples for so long and in such diverse fields, with an irresistible power which has not yet exhausted itself today, though its creators vanished from history 2,000 years ago, may easily be overvalued. It can hardly be overlooked.
So there we go. What did the Greeks do for us? Why does Rocker say that it has influenced the totality of European culture for so long? Possibly most famously their contributions to mathematics. Science in general, but mathematics in particular. Euclid is often mentioned today in geometry. Geometry largely comes from the Greeks. They worked out that the Earth was a sphere, that it rotated on its axis every 24 hours. They worked out the diameter of the sphere, and they worked out that it went round the sun. They knew all of that when much sillier things got believed for 1,000 years after them. They found fossils, and they believed that these were the remains of animals which had gone extinct. They developed much of the sort of ideas that formed the basis of the scientific methodology. All the precursor ideas that you needed before you could. It may seem quite simple to us, scientific attitude, scientific methodology, because they're so bound up in our culture, but it took a long time to develop, and the Greeks are responsible for a lot of that. They're remembered for their art a great deal. The Greek sculptures are the most famous because they're made of rock and they last. Roman tourists, they described Greece as one gigantic art museum, just like the quantity of sculpture and such great sculpture that you had all over Greece wasn't seen in any other culture of that time. Sculptures are best preserved, but their poetry, their drama, their comedy, painting, architecture, in just about every field of art, they were regarded by other civilizations of their time and by later European civilizations as like head and shoulders above just about everyone else. They're famously, democracy is a Greek word. Most of our positive political ideas, the good ones, come from Greece. The idea that a society should be accountable to its citizens, that the process of society should be monitored by the citizens as a whole, serve the interests of the citizens as a whole. that society should be designed to provide the people that live in it with freedom. The first time we have any record of these ideas being clearly expressed is in classical Greece. First of all, we have the Renaissance, which means rebirth, which occurred in Europe, signalling the end of the Middle Ages. What it was the rebirth of was Greek attitudes, and the rebirth of all this art and culture and so forth. We have all the famous Renaissance painting and architecture and so forth that you can find in Southern Europe, and that still, is one of the major draws of people going travelling in Southern Europe. Like everyone wants to see the Renaissance art because it's so wicked. Okay, so this is a timeline of ancient Greece. It's confusing because the bigger the number, the further ago, the further long ago it is. It can be a bit counterintuitive, but here we are. So what we're really interested in is the classical period. This is the period that pretty much all the philosophy, the arts, the culture, all the good stuff that Greece is remembered for comes from. But we want to look at what happened before and after to put it in context. So we first of all we start out with what's called the Age of Kings, where most of the societies in Greece were a hereditary king thing ruled by a hereditary aristocracy, and it was like that. It's the society described in the Iliad, where you have these various rulers beefing with each other. Following that we have the Age of Tyrants, which is followed by the classical period. Then we have the Hellenistic period, which is the period when Greece and most of the world that was influenced by Greece were ruled by the various warring successors of Alexander, who history calls the Great. And then we move into the period where Greece and the Greek influenced East was under Roman rule. What's really interesting is that the classical period, where all the art and stuff comes from, corresponds almost exactly to the period when Athens was a democracy, when Athenian democracy was in full bloom, and when many other city-states across Greece practiced democracy similar to Athens.
What was the Age of Tyrants?
You're going to find out.
It's very sensitive, this people.
Okay, so this is the Iliad. This is the oldest written work in Greek. It's the Greeks' national myth. It's fantastic. You should all read it. Better yet, you should all listen to it as an audiobook, because it wasn't created to be read on paper. It was created for people around a fire to hear somebody recite it aloud. It's very powerful. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Achilles, murderous doomed, who cost the Achaeans countless losses. Sturdy souls hurled down to Hades' dark hall, their bodies given over to the tender feasting of dog and crow. As Zeus' will moves towards its end, now let us begin. When there clashed Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. That's how it begins, and so it carries on, a roaring rampage of passion, bloodshed and revenge. Really good. What I find fascinating about the Iliad is the effect that it had on the Greek religion. Essentially what the Iliad did is it made sure that the people in Greece couldn't take their religion seriously anymore. Now that their god had been depicted in this epic drama, they couldn't take them seriously as gods to be feared or worshipped. They become characters in a work of art. In Greece there was no organised priesthood, there was no formalised dogma. Religion looks very different to how it does in most other societies. Even in places like Babylon, where women had more freedom than they did in Greece. You know, you had an organised priesthood and you had the dogma. In Greece, it wasn't like that. It was just part of folk culture. It was part of art, their religion.
I don't understand. Sorry.
Oh,
Sorry.
oh,
It's just sensitive.
we can mess around with it when we do the. Yeah. Onward.
Okay. Hold on.
Okay. As much as I admire the Greeks, I don't want to whitewash them. Here is Friedrich Nietzsche, rock star philosopher. His day job was to be a professor of ancient Greece. In my opinion, he understood the Greeks better than any other modern I know of. Anyone want to be Nietzsche? No.
Maybe.
Shall I?
Go for it, Petra.
My English. The Greeks are the most human people of ancient time, have a trait of cruelty of tiger, like pleasure and destruction in them. Why did the Greek sculptor again and again have to represent war and battles, endlessly repeated, human bodies stretched out, their scenes told with hatred or the arrogance of triumph? The one that doubled up in gain, dying in agony. Why did the whole Greek world exalt in picture of fighting in the Iliad?
Iliad.
I fear we do not understand these things enough of Greek fashion and would shudder if we did.
We would shudder if we did. Yeah, the Greeks, they embraced all their passions, as creative and artistic as they were. Yeah, all their emotions they gave vent to, and they felt shame in none of them. So, you asked about the age of tyrants. Tyrants, good or bad? Bad.
True.
Bad.
Okay, well certainly that is what Greek writers the Greek writers whose writings survive, who are, to a man, very rich people. We don't have the writings of a single poor Greek. Those haven't survived. Yeah, the rich commentators, without fail, slate the tyrants, say they were awful. So yeah, this is Solon, tyrant of Athens. His most famous act was that he abolished enslavement for debt. If you were in debt, as you know, a poor farmer would often get in debt if they had a bad harvest or whatever, and you couldn't pay, you'd be sold into slavery. He abolished that. It was, yeah, the oligarch's game was, yeah, predatory lending was very common in ancient Greece, and he spoiled their fun. What a bastard. So yeah, you have the Age of Tyrants, which lasts about 2 generations. So tyrannos, which is where the word tyrant comes from, it means illegitimate ruler. That is, you were a ruler and your father was not a ruler. That is what a tyrant was. And that's how they differ from kings. A king's father was also king. And yeah, then after 2 generations of this, we have the classical period and republican government. Yes, it's prior to the Age of Tyrants, people had no democratic popular institutions. They had no experience of organising society without a king, so it's obvious there was going to need to be some trial and error before a better way could be found. This is Gustav Glotz, who is a historian of ancient Greece. Anyone? Yes.
The people regarded tyranny only as an expedient. They used it as a battering ram with which to demolish the citadel of the oligarchs, and when this had been achieved, they hastily abandoned the weapon which wounded their heads.
Yeah. There we go. Okay, so following the Age of Tyrants, everywhere except Sparta becomes a republic. People abandon the weapon that wounds their hands, get rid of the tyrants, and they found republics. Except Sparta. While tyrants get slated in the surviving writings, Sparta is represented very, very well. Sparta was the only society in Greece which retained a hereditary aristocracy. If you wanted to be a citizen in Sparta, there's no like wanting to in it. If you were a citizen in Sparta, if your father was a citizen in Sparta, that's how it worked. Here we have a 300, Frank Miller's Ode to Fascism. Sparta, hugely admired by fascists all over the shop, from Mussolini to Thomas Jefferson. There's loads of cities in America named after Sparta. The Sparta was adored by the American founding fathers, because at least according to legend, Sparta had the mythical founder Lycurgus, who laid out the rules in the Constitution, and that Constitution then remained and was never changed forever, which is what the American founding fathers were after. Okay, so yeah.
No, sorry.
I mean, obviously there's a lot of inaccuracies in 300. For one thing, the Spartans wore armour. They're represented in the surviving writings as these like heroic super warriors. The reality is quite different. I mean, they considered their greatest triumph to be the Battle of Thermopylae, which was a defeat with 100% casualties. In 300, we have the Persian fleet destroyed by storm, by the wrath of Zeus. In reality, it was the Athenian navy that did that. And then the decisive battle of that war against Persia was Marathon, where Athens took the decisive role, leading a coalition of other cities. Spartans hung back and they thought, well, we'll wait till everyone else is losing, then we'll come in and save the day and be the heroes. Everyone else didn't lose, they won. And then they thought that the Spartans were a pack of cowards. So some people, I don't know why, but some people really enjoy reading about child abuse. There was a book, A Child Called It, sold very well. If that's your thing, have a read about the Spartan education system. The Spartan young men, they had all these weird tortures that they were subjected to in an attempt to make them resistant to pain. They'd cover them in oil and make them dance in synchronized for hours in the midday sun. They'd starve them, then make them fight over cheese while being beaten. All these events are like ticketed, and like the population would come and watch and thought it was great. Mostly lots and lots of whipping with frequent deaths. It seems so grisly, and this is as recorded by admirers of Sparta. You sometimes wonder, maybe the slaves had it better. Sparta, the reason it was so brutal was that they had over 10 slaves to every free Spartan. They were terrified of their slaves. The reason they only sent 300 men to Thermopylae was because they couldn't risk letting the rest of their army move too far from Sparta in case the slaves rose up. That was their purpose of these heroic super warriors. It was not fighting other professional soldiers, it was keeping the slaves down. As a Spartan young man, the coming of age ritual was to go out into the countryside. You had to kill a slave and bring back proof, and that was how you became a man. Obviously if you could kill more than one, that was better. It was competitive. Those who did well were inducted into the Cryptia, which was it's a bunch of death squads that roved the countryside, terrorising the slaves with random killings. A few years in that, you're guaranteed for high state office. So that's Sparta. Everywhere else, following the Age of Tyrants, we get republican government, which took two forms: democracy and oligarchy. Democracy has got kind of a sullied name these days. Because we have what's called representative democracy. You vote for your representative, who then goes to Parliament and votes on laws. And the representative can say one thing while being elected, and then vote to do the exact opposite. In Athens, it was different. You had the assembly, which any free citizen was entitled to go to and vote directly on the decisions. The assembly seated about 4,000. You were actually paid by the state to attend the assembly. This was to ensure that poor Athenians who had to work all the time for their living were able to participate in the political process. It wasn't like you were missing a day's work and your family would go hungry if there was an important decision you wanted to vote on. You could go because you were paid. Most of the important offices in Athens, they were assigned by lot, by random lot, sort of like jury service today. And the very important offices were, only a few of them were elected. On the other hand, you have oligarchy, where it's different from a hereditary aristocracy because anyone can be a citizen, can participate in politics, can vote on decisions, so long as they have enough money. There's a property qualification you had to meet in order to get your political rights. That was normally set at the amount of property required to serve as a hot plate, in order to get the gear and to be able to take time away from your farm for training, to go on campaign. So the classical era was characterised by conflict all across Greece, bloody wars between these two sorts of government. So yes, in Athenian democracy we have the earliest examples of the aim of Athenian democracy. They called it eleutheria. I'm probably mauling that. It roughly means freedom. Even the enemies of freedom and democracy in Greece, they didn't deny that this was the aim of democracy. Plato, in his characteristic fashion, is like, in democracy, even the animals are full of freedom. Direct democracy, which we've talked about. Athens is the earliest example we have of this happening on any sort of large scale. Majority voting, that's something we get from ancient Greece. Free speech as a expressed principle, as part of the laws and constitution, the right to free speech. This was considered essential to the functioning of a democracy, and the Greeks took it, the Athenians and those following a similar constitution took it very seriously. The idea of equality before the law. In Rome, how much your voice mattered as a witness in court. They had this mathematical adjustment based on how much money you had. In Athens, all citizens were considered equal before the law. This was considered really important because in the ancient world there was constant class struggle over access to land. You had the wealthy oligarchs constantly trying to shove poor people off their land and take it with bailiffs, hired thugs, and the law courts were very important for this.
Do you know how equal it was in practice? Like it might have been expressed in law as equal, but do you know how it actually was?
We, unfortunately, records are quite patchy. I mean, this was very long ago. But everywhere else, it wasn't expressed in principle. Athens was the first place. I assume it was fairly equal. I mean, why else would the state pay people to come and attend the assembly? If it was actually, if it was technically in law, it was a democracy, but in practice it was an oligarchy, they wouldn't have done that. And you can see constant class struggle over all these things. These things were bitterly fought over throughout the history of all the various Greek democracies. So yes, they did vary, but there was always a strong force pushing for it. All citizens being eligible for jury service. Pretty much everywhere else, running the courts was sort of a hereditary family thing. You'd have, in Rome it was called the curial class, where it was passed down from father to son, like to be a magistrate or whatever. In Athens, it was done by random lot who would serve in the juries. This was considered very important to ensure that the law courts were in control of the people and not the wealthy. And this is, something else we get from ancient Greece.
I'm though quite sure that it was only men above 30, right?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, but yes, it was women could not vote. So, if you like this talk, I have a book that I recommend. I mean, you may look at this and be like, ooh, class struggle, that's like wonky Marxist bollocks, isn't it? Actually, this is the second most cited book on ancient Greece by historians of ancient Greece. This is the second most commonly cited. It's incredibly influential. Very, very good. All history is the history of class struggle, including the history of ancient Greece. If you fancy a fat tome, this is what I recommend. Here we have Xenophon, who was a philosopher, historian, warrior from Athens. He favoured oligarchy, nevertheless, this is what he said. You got a Xenophon in the room?
Whenever there is a division within a city along class lines, the rich will naturally turn to Sparta and the demos to Athens.
There we go. So yes, there was, we all know this running conflict between Athens and Sparta, sometimes as open war, sometimes as something a bit more like the Cold War, which characterised the whole classical era of Greece. That's essentially how it worked. There was bitter class struggle within the cities, and what you actually see is that either faction, the demos, meaning like everyone who wasn't an oligarch, and the oligarchs, would prefer foreign rule to the victory of the other faction in their own city. We see this over and over again, that they're given the choice. And it was, the class struggle was much more, within cities, was much more important than the struggle between cities generally. And we see that the oligarchs essentially sold out their own cities when they came under Roman and Macedonian rule. The nature of the class struggle in Greece. We often tend to imagine that a past society was like ours, but with less technology. But the economic structure of past societies is often very different. Wage labour, being an employee, working for somebody else and getting paid for it, was very, very rare in ancient Greece. Very few people did this. It was held in contempt. It was seen as analogous to slavery, so this wasn't what the class conflict was. It wasn't a struggle between bosses and workers. It was generally a struggle over debt and land. Pretty much the whole Greek economy was agricultural. Other parts of the economy were very small in comparison. And so it was all about access to land. We talked about how it was seen as important by the Democrats that the law courts be under popular control, so that the oligarchs couldn't just gobble up all the land. You had a lot of predatory lending, which again, like being paid to attend the assembly, helped somewhat against, but there was a lot of predatory lending. In the oligarchies, you would be enslaved if you couldn't pay your debts. Solon, tyrant of Athens, did away with that in Athens, but still, there was constant struggle to have debt jubilees. Solon writ off all the debts at one point. There's a constant struggle to have the debts written off was the other demand. Redistribute the land and cancel the debts is the demand of peasants throughout history. The political constitution was generally seen as like the soul of the city. That was what people tended to fight over the most. And as we said, class loyalties, tended to trump loyalty to your city-state or your hostility to a foreign power. So Athenian society, we've talked about the political structure. The activities that were held in the most regard were philosophy, which included natural science, art, athletics and war. If you wanted respect, these were the things you did. David Graeber talks a lot when he talks about ancient Greece about their understanding of honour. War was the most profitable activity in the ancient world because prisoners got enslaved. If you wanted to be a war leader, you needed honour, and you got honour by giving away your plunder. This redistribution was something that happened quite a lot. During the Persian War, where Sparta fought at Thermopylae and lost, after Athens fought a marathon and won. During this time, the Athenian state spent more on the theatre than it did on the military. If you imagine any modern state doing that, it sort of gives you some sort of idea of the character of Athenian society. As we said, there's no organised priesthood, and attitudes, you read ancient Greek thinkers and their attitudes are